Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Canadian Story. My name is David Parker, and I'm joined by my guest, Rachel Emmanuel, and my co-host, Zach Gerber. Welcome to the show. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
So we're excited to talk to you today about a number of different topics, but I think what the listeners are most interested in right now is about your story, what's happened over the last 2 years for you, the things you've seen. So why don't you walk us through a little bit of your background, how you got here? You're working for the Western Standard now, but you were a reporter for the Globe and Mail as well as iPolitics. So why not share a bit of your bio with listeners? This is a short, 2-minute thing.
Absolutely. Sure. So I'm initially from the Niagara region, Southern Ontario, great place to grow up. I've always been very interested in politics and especially media. So I studied journalism at Carleton University because it seemed like the place to be for somebody who wanted to go into political reporting, being the capital, and Carleton having a reputation as Canada's best journalism school, or at least one of the best. So I studied there. I had a really difficult time in university. It was full of sort of the woke ideology that was being pushed on us on campuses, and I really struggled through that. But I was very determined to graduate with my degree, so I stuck through it and got quite lucky. As soon as I graduated, I got an internship at the Globe and Mail. It was a brand new internship called the Political Matters internship, which placed me at the Globe and Mail for the summer. So that was a really good experience. And then immediately following that, I got hired at iPolitics, which for people that don't know, iPolitics is owned by the Toronto Star. There were some ownership changes while I was employed with them. So instead of being 100% owned by the Toronto Star, they're owned about 51% by this new board that is eventually hoping to take over full ownership of it within a couple of years. It's just like most media companies in Canada. It's not currently financially viable, doesn't make any money. It actually probably loses quite a bit of money year over year. So it doesn't make sense for this board to entirely own it right now. So they own 51% of it, and the Toronto Star owns the remaining 49%. So I got hired with them in 2019 after I graduated, which I'm very lucky to have graduated ahead of the COVID-19 pandemic. I do not envy any of the graduates that were trying to find work during the pandemic. But it made for an interesting time because I was only reporting in person for a couple months, maybe about less than 8 months before the pandemic hit, at which time I was working remotely from home. So obviously, COVID was a very bizarre time for all of us. And it was especially bizarre being young and in the media and trying to figure out a way that was covering it and being quite uncomfortable with the way everyone else was covering it and thinking that there must be something more here, but wondering sort of was the only person that wanted to do things a little bit differently. So there's obviously a large story there. I'm sure you have some follow-up questions I'll wait for before I get into it.
I have a question already, if I may. As someone who didn't go to journalism school, but has been over the past 2 years rather confused by journalism, what is it that they teach in journalism school?
I honestly wonder if it's maybe more of what they don't teach and the conversations that you're simply not able to have. And it wasn't even always the professor's fault, as it was just sort of this culture of fear on campuses. And this is not a secret. You can read about this. A lot of places are covering it. A lot of professors are speaking out about it. Students are afraid to have real meaningful discussions on university campuses because you're afraid of being labeled as a racist. You're afraid of not having friends, as being labeled as offensive. And we just weren't able to have any meaningful discussions. I remember at one point I was taking a foreign correspondence class, and that's something that's always really interested in me. I really wanted to be a war correspondent when I was studying at Carleton University. And so I'd taken this foreign correspondence class that I was so looking forward to. And I remember in the class, we were studying reporters who'd gone overseas and covered wars, and obviously they had covered some really horrific things. And people in my class said it was offensive that they would have even covered those wars. And so we weren't even able to have discussions about how to properly cover those things while we're maintaining respect for people that are dying, doing it in an ethical way, because people just said it was so offensive that they would have gone over there and exploited these people that were dying. When in reality, it's so important that we have journalists go and cover these types of things, because otherwise no one is going to be aware of it. Like, for the rest of the world to be aware of what's going on and for change to actually have an impact, people need to be informed. So if we didn't have, foreign correspondents and journalists that were willing to risk their lives to cover these wars, we would be in a much worse state. But simply people thought it was offensive that anyone would go over and, take photos of dead bodies or take video imagery of it. And so we were just sort of not able to have any discussions on that in the class, other than basically people saying this was offensive.
Wow.
Huh. So they're teaching in journalism school what is okay and not okay to report on.
Yeah, I think they're teaching that. I think also just sort of when you look at the people that are going into journalism school, it's people who come in with a lot of biases. Certainly in my program, there was a lot of social justice warriors, more so than you would see in a business program, for example. And so people really did not want to have these types of difficult discussions. And that made things difficult for the professors who didn't exactly encourage hard discussions either. Journalism is definitely, by and large, a industry that attracts a certain type of people, and a lot of times it is people with a bit of an agenda or people that are just simply more liberal to begin with. I think a lot of conservatives tend to go into the trades and sort of like to keep to themselves in that way, and that's a problem that we have. We are losing the culture war. We are losing the front on the culture. And so, conservatives, if they want to see change, they need to begin by going into all avenues and all different types of careers, not just sticking with the things that allow them to not have those uncomfortable confrontations as I did at university. So that was definitely a part of it. But even, Carleton University, currently their journalism program is headed by somebody who's run for the Liberal Party on many different occasions. So you're going to get biases with that. And I think it's time maybe they look those biases in the face and try to attract professors that have something different to offer.
I want to go into something you said earlier that I think is interesting. You said, what makes a person want to become a journalist? Because there's probably, this is a story that hopefully will inspire younger listeners to maybe become journalists. Your story is, that's the hope anyway. That's the whole purpose of the Canadian story, is to tell the individual stories of Canadian excellence so that they can so we can kind of build up this narrative of what our country actually is. So why did you want to become a journalist? You said, I always wanted to be a war correspondent, but what was it that drew you to it? Because we need to show people how they can engage in this culture war, and you're a great example of that. So why don't you share with the listeners what it was initially what's your story? What brought you to journalism school?
I decided it a little bit late in high school. I always knew I was going to do something with writing. Writing is sort of my passion and also one skill. So I didn't really have too many options, but I was in grade 12, I was taking a writer's craft course, and every time we wrote an essay, we had to pick a different topic, and we were allowed to pick anything we wanted to write about. And then we would write a different type of essay, maybe every couple of weeks. And I found myself constantly writing about the Kathleen Wynne government. Kathleen Wynne was the Ontario premier at the time, and she was absolutely destroying our province, and it was just creating a lot of headaches. And there were so many scandals with that government, so much money wasted, so many businesses were closing. I remember businesses were hanging signs outside basically being like, you win, with like a pun on her name, because the hydro bills were so expensive. It was just closing businesses left, right, and center. So I was seeing the effect happening in my province, and I was just writing about it for my high school classmates. They really did not appreciate it. They were not interested in it at all. But at this point I thought, you know what, I actually really enjoy doing this. I really like writing about politics. It's hard to make a living as a writer, but politics is one of the ways that you can absolutely do that. So I decided to pursue a career in political journalism.
How?
So what was it that made you decide you wanted to be a writer?
I don't even think I ever had a defining moment. It was just sort of an obvious thing. It wasn't even a question as to whether or not that was what I was going to do. I think I just always kind of inherently knew it. Even like I have a lot of assignments that I saved from when I was younger, or rather my mom saved a lot of work that I did when I was younger. So sometimes when I'm visiting, I'll flip through some old boxes, and I have like an essay I wrote in grade 6 that like I won an award on. Like, it was just always the one thing I really enjoyed doing. I remember in grade 8, we had an assignment where we had to write a children's book, and the teacher came up to me afterwards and was like, oh, you could definitely do this as a living. Like, you could totally do this as a living. So it was sort of obvious. There was never a question that I was going to do anything else.
What do you think it was that attracted you to politics? My own personal story, I guess, around that is I didn't really even ever think, certainly I didn't think about politics really at all in high school. And I didn't really actually start thinking about it until Trump won in, I guess it would be 2016. And I was like, wow, it's really interesting how mad people are. Like, why? That's so weird. And then, of course, I watched the election as he ran again, and then COVID happened and all of that. And now, obviously, I'm quite interested in politics. But what, as someone who was young, attracted you to politics?
I think that sort of goes back to the nature versus nurture argument. It's something I've wondered a little bit myself. What is inherently things that you're just interested in, and what are things that are taught to you? My family was pretty political growing up. My dad was active in politics. So it was just conversations we had around the dinner table that would have had an impression on me at a young age. And my brothers certainly would discuss these things. So I was just around these types of conversations. And then as I got older, I maintained an interest even in high school. Like I was interested in student council and did some work on that. But I think one of the things was for me that I grew up so religious, and I think religion is great. I think it gives people an identity and helps them to form community. But a lot of times religious communities have problems where they just keep so much to themselves. And certainly that was my experience growing up in Niagara. We had this great Christian community, and I think the beliefs and the people there are awesome, but people keep to themselves so much. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about, conservatives sometimes being blue collar workers, and they want to stay in the trades and earn a lot of money, really be really successful, but they're not getting active in fields that could make an impact in the world. And this was certainly my experience in Niagara. A lot of people think about Niagara, they think about farming. We actually have so many tradesmen in Niagara. So all my friends, all my male friends growing up went into the trades. And so we had this great belief system. And I think that it was a really good belief system, and it was a really healthy way to grow up. But we weren't sharing that with the world, and we certainly weren't impacting our broader community. It just kind of stayed within the Christian circle that I grew up in. And I saw that as an issue because people were quite closed-minded to the world around them, but they also didn't see how you need to stand up for your values, you need to use your freedoms, or you're going to lose them. So when COVID happened and the government came in and they trampled all over our rights and freedoms, and they went into the Christian school the private Christian school that I attended growing up, and they were able to put all these regulations and restrictions on it, and people thought, well, wait, we spend so much money to send our kids, and we have a private school so that we don't have to deal with specific government regulations. And people were really surprised by this. And they kind of wondered how it had happened. And it's like, well, you haven't been paying attention for the last 2 decades. Like, look at the legislation that's being passed in Parliament. Like, all of this stuff is slowly over time being designed to create a system where the government can just walk in and strip away your rights and freedoms because you've just been slowly handing stuff over to them for years and years and years. And so just someone who is being interested in politics at a young age, I saw the need to be invested and to be fighting for the culture and the society that I wanted to see around me. I don't know why that is. Probably, like I said, because my family was political growing up. And certainly, I think the awakening that I always kind of had has been sort of what everyone else has experienced during COVID. People are waking up and they're saying, no, we need to fight for the society and the culture that we want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I would count myself in that boat of people who wasn't paying attention. I certainly wasn't. And then you wake up one day and it's been COVID for a year, and all of a sudden the entire landscape of your country has changed. And I would have, I like pretty much everyone I would talk to would say, so we're what, 2.5 years into it now. If you were to think back 2.5 years ago, and if you were to tell me, like, the person that I was then, what has transpired, I would be like, no, like, you're kidding. Like, absolutely not. That can't happen here. That can't happen here. And even as things were happening in other countries, like lockdowns, like mandates, like those sorts of things, it was still, well, yeah, but that won't happen here. Like, no, not here. And boy, were we wrong, weren't we?
Oh, yeah. Well, that brings us to an interesting question, right? Which is, what is the role of journalism in this, and what's happened to Canadian journalism? Because there's a huge disconnect between what happened in Ottawa with the truckers and how the media reported. And that was a big part of your story too, Rachel, and what happened at iPolitics. So I know you've shared this on True North and other venues, but probably a bunch of our listeners haven't heard it yet. So why don't you share with the listeners what happened with you at iPolitics? How you took your stand, which is maybe different than a lot of other people's stand, because it's in an industry that's perhaps you just expect people would always be able to take a stand, right?
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned, I was working at iPolitics right out of university, and I was reporting for them remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I was, very quickly frustrated. The 2 weeks to flatten the curve turned into 2 months. All of a sudden, we're seeing all these crazy restrictions and regulations, and it's just not ending. It's just not ending, especially in Ontario. We had some of the worst lockdowns and restrictions in any sub-government across North America. So I was trying to cover things in a little bit of a different way. I was wondering why we were still seeing these restrictions, when we were going to be, our rights and freedoms were going to be given some respect. And so I was kind of coming up against a lot of backlash at my work for covering things, being more critical of the government. So just to give you sort of like an easy example, there would be some sort of press conference, and every reporter there would seemingly be asking, why haven't you implemented these restrictions? Why are we not seeing more lockdowns? Why is the mask mandate not ending longer? Why are we not adding like third vaccine doses? These were all the types of questions other reporters were asking. And I was more thinking along the lines of, what are we doing? Like, we have lost our minds. Like, the government does not have the authority to take these liberties away from us. So I was getting into quite a bit of trouble at work for my coverage. My editor certainly did not appreciate it. What made things more difficult for me was when Aaron O'Toole was leader of the Conservative Party, he did absolutely nothing to stand up for conservative civil liberties, Canadian civil liberties. So I didn't even have an official opposition to point to and say, well, look, other people are concerned about it. The only MP that I could actually point to for most of the time was Derek Sloan, who was an independent MP, had been kicked out of the Conservative Party during COVID. He was one of the few federal politicians, actually the only, that was willing to speak up for Canadian civil liberties. The rest of the Conservative caucus had been whipped into not speaking up. I mean, a couple people did some things here and there on vaccines. I remember Leslyn Lewis, now a Conservative leadership candidate, speaking up against like coerced vaccination for children and saying this is really not necessary. But honestly, by and large, Conservative MPs really did not do much for Canadians. So my editors were saying to me, no one's really speaking up against this. You continually are referring to Derek Sloan in your articles. He really does not represent very many Canadians. I don't think as many people care about these lockdowns and about these vaccine mandates as you think. Wow. And I know you have to laugh. You have to laugh. And I'm like, you're so out of touch with the Canadian public. And I think a big benefit for me was that I was working remotely. When COVID happened, I moved back home to Niagara. I was living with my mom. I was getting sort of some of the sentiments from Niagara, and people there were very unhappy and very concerned about the direction their country was heading in. And I feel like that was such an advantage for me to be out of the Ottawa bubble, is what we call it. You're in Ottawa all the time. People there are just a little different. Everywhere in Canada, people are different. There's different societies. It's important for reporters to have a good, finger on the pulse of what the nation is feeling and what different concerns are across the country. But you lose that when you're in Ottawa too much. So it was certainly such a blessing for me to be able to be in Niagara. And I was saying, no, people are really concerned about this stuff. There is a wide portion of the Canadian public that supports Derek Sloan and that hates the lockdowns and that doesn't agree with the vaccine mandates. And I think we should be proud that we speak for those people, because we're the only federal publication that speaks for these people right now. But so it went. So sometimes I would be able to get some things published that I was proud of. Sometimes I would write something that I was proud of and it would be heavily edited, and the language would just be changed to the point where I really didn't feel like it represented what I wrote, and I was quite uncomfortable to have my name on it at the end of it. And then there was many times when I just wouldn't even touch an issue because I knew how I was going to have to write about it, and I was like, I don't even want to cover it. I'm not comfortable with the changes that I already know are going to be made and published under my name. So there was sort of a battle. I'd have to kind of pick and choose my battles here and there. And I remember, for example, when the truckers' convoy rolled up to Ottawa, iPolitics was very heavily focused on federal policy. So we wouldn't necessarily just go walk around the truckers' convoy and write a piece about it. We would talk about the federal policy that was impacting the convoy. So like the Emergencies Act would be the perfect example of that. But the very first weekend after they rolled into town, we had our Monday morning news meeting, and my editor was already talking about how horrible the convoy was. And I was just kind of like, you know what? I don't know if this is a battle that I'm going to win. I don't know how much I really want to cover the convoy. So other than posting some stuff to my personal Twitter account here and there, I didn't write about it too much. But what happened midway through the truckers' convoy is Deputy Finance Minister or Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland was at a rally in support of Ukraine. And she was spotted with a flag, with a banner. It was a red and black banner that had Stefan Bandera's slogan written on it. And he was sort of known as a figure in Ukraine who was essentially a Nazi. He was responsible for the death of millions of Jews, and people that he trained underneath him were also responsible for the deaths of millions of Jews. However, his history has sort of been forgotten and I guess mangled a little bit in Ukraine's history. He's really respected as maybe a war hero. He's respected as somebody who stood up for Ukraine and believed in Ukraine's ability to fight for himself, fight for itself, essentially. So what he means, it's kind of been changed over the past number of years. That being said, that his really horrible history, it still exists. And so she was spotted with this flag, she was photographed with this flag at a protest. I believe it was in Toronto. And she'd actually posted the photo to her Twitter account. And then people started saying, hey, why are you posing with this flag? That's a Nazi flag. And so she deletes the photo, sort of an admission of guilt, no explanation, and posts a different photo without the flag in it and continues on her merry way. Well, too late, people had already picked up on the story, and then a bunch of conservative media outlets start reporting on it. True North was the first to pick up on the story. And I'm kind of looking around and I'm like, oh, no one in MSM's covering this. This is a really good story. This is a big story. I'm going to cover it.
MSM, for those who don't know, is mainstream media.
Yes, thank you. Mainstream media. So I, send her office an email, and they immediately call me up and they say, this is Russian propaganda. You're being played. There's really no need to cover this. And I thought, if that's what your official response is going to be, put it in an email and I'll put that in the story. Like, I'm fine with that, but I'm going to write about it. I'm not going to be dissuaded from writing about it. So I really wanted to do my due diligence on the story just because the criticism of it was quite heavy, and because no one else in the mainstream media had covered it, I thought I really want to do this carefully. So, we made sure to get comment from her office, and I spoke to a Ukrainian expert who actually had known Chrystia Freeland for like his whole life. So that's also something to be aware of. He has a bias in the story. And he was also saying, he was very critical of my coverage, even the fact that I was going to be writing about it. He said, there are people that are dying in Ukraine. I don't know that it's really worth it to give this story any oxygen. There's much more important stories to be covering. And so I included that all in the story. So I wrote up the story. I included, how it was a neo-Nazi flag. Chrystia Freeland had been photographed with it. Her office saying that she, of course, is not a Nazi, and denouncing the symbolism. And then, of course, the experts' comments saying, I don't think this story deserves any oxygen. A lot of people don't know who Bandera was or what his movement was, and that's not really what he represents anymore. People are quite ignorant to his history. And so I write up the story, it's published, it's doing really well on our site, getting a lot of traction. And then I get a call from an editor who had actually not even technically started with us at the time. So I was quite surprised that she was calling me, and she basically is just so upset about the story. She starts ripping into me for the story. Chrystia Freeland's office called, she says, and they're really unhappy with the story. Can you walk me through the process of how this got published? I'm thinking, well, what do you mean how it got published? It got published the same as all our other stories got published. I wrote it, an editor edited it, the copy editor looked it over, and then we published it. I didn't just write something and publish it to the website. So also worth noting that during this time, we were in between actual editors. So I was doing editor duties with my colleague. So I was both a reporter and an editor at this time. And so I walk her through the story of how it gets published. And she's like, well, I have to look into this. And then she's like, I'm actually going to call the expert that you spoke to back and make sure you reported him accurately and fairly, which to me is just so disrespectful and insulting. I've never had an editor say, I'm going to call your sources and double check what you reported. They obviously do not trust you. At this point, I wouldn't even feel comfortable working underneath someone who has so little abilities in my reporting skills. A couple hours later, she calls me back and she says, I've made some changes to the stories, to your story. I'm really concerned about how this got published. And I'm like, okay, well, you've now made changes to my story that I hadn't even had a chance to review. So I'm going to go look at it. Any reference of the word Nazi had been removed, and the story as a whole had just been watered down. Another thing that Chrystia Freeland's office was really upset about was that we had referred to the banner as opposed to a scarf, because it was sort of like a long scarf or banner, but it was being like held, like two people were holding it and like three people were standing behind it. And it was so funny because I had referred to it interchangeably as a flag and as a banner in my article. As a flag and as a scarf in my article. And then my copy editor, after looking at it, had decided to go with the word banner. But that was something that the editor decided to get really upset about. So she scrubbed all references of the word banner and changed it all to scarf, and just really watered down the article to make it seem like Chrystia Freeland had been coincidentally photographed with a black and red scarf that had at times been known with the Bandera movement, when in fact it was the exact colors of this movement. It had his slogan on it, even had his emblem emblazoned on it. And there was lots of these flags pictured throughout the rally that Chrystia Freeland was at. So at this point, I basically knew I can't write for iPolitics anymore. This has just gone on way too long. And Actually, the next day, and at this point, I'd already been thinking to join the Western Standard. But the next day, I got a call from my editor saying, "You're not allowed to edit articles anymore. You're being demoted back to just a reporter. We can't trust you editing articles." And I said, "Okay, well, I think that means my time here is up because I can't write for you guys anymore. I'm not comfortable with how my work is being changed and not reflecting, and just sort of the unethical ways that they've gone about it. For example, to just change an article like that and then not run a proper correction on it, to change an article like that and to not run it by the reporter who wrote it up in the first place, and to call back a source that is close with another source you're writing about. So in this instance, the Ukrainian expert who was quite close with Chrystia Freeland and even was a friend of hers. You have to be quite careful how you write up someone's comments because they have a bias. And she just kind of gave this professor like a full airway to say whatever he wanted to say without really coming at it from any sort of critiquing lens or critical thinking. So at this point, I decided I was going to leave effective immediately and join the Western Standard. And then I wrote about it for the Western Standard, mostly because I felt like I needed to be accountable for words that have been published under my name over the last 2 years, lots of which I didn't agree with. And because people were wondering, and as a media personality or just someone in the media, you are a bit more of a public figure than the average Canadian person. So I just felt like I had to give an account for things that had happened.
Right. And so, sorry, David, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Zach. Go ahead, Zach.
So why don't you contrast that story with what it's like working at the Western Standard? What is that like?
So Western Standard is new media. So we're a bit of a startup. I believe the company is just under 2 years old now. And it's a totally different experience. I mean, startups have their own problems, but I have never experienced any heavy editing on my work. The language has never changed to anything that I disagree with. You have a lot more room for opportunity. And just to sort of pursue things that you're interested in. Like I was so constantly discouraged from pursuing stories that I thought mattered to the Canadian public and that I thought weren't being covered. There's so much groupthink in mainstream media. And it's like whenever you try to step outside that groupthink, you're pulled back in. So yeah, I have so much opportunity to write about the stories that I think aren't being covered and to just pursue things in a different way. So it's been quite a relief, honestly. I really enjoy it. I think that they give their writers a lot of liberty and we're covering things that nobody else in Canada is covering. So it's I'm very proud to work for them.
Have you ever thought about why groupthink has permeated media and seemingly everything else? It feels like media should be an industry where groupthink is actively discouraged, right? Because the purpose of media is supposed to be to seek the truth, and groupthink kind of gets in the way of that. Why do you think media has allowed itself to fall into that?
That's a good question. I think there's a couple things probably feeding into that. I think part of it is people of a certain mindset, who are going into media. Part of it is just the woke ideology that's taking over our entire culture right now. So people across the board in every single industry are afraid to think differently. They're afraid to do things differently. And then I also think within media, with there being so few reporters nowadays, you think that you've missed something if you're doing something differently, or if you're covering something that other people aren't covering. You're a little worried about like stepping out of line and being seen as being different. I really struggled because obviously I'm quite young, and most of the reporters covering Ottawa are rightly, decades into their career and they're experts in their industry. So when I felt like I was doing something different in comparison to them, I thought, well, I must be doing something wrong. So I had a really hard time with that until I eventually just realized, no, we have totally different worldviews, and there's just no scenario in which I'm going to ask the same questions that you're asking, because I actually don't think we should tell people what they should put in their bodies. I know that sounds so groundbreaking, but that took me a really long time to adjust to and just to become comfortable with. So I think there's a lot of different factors feeding into that.
Yeah, interesting.
I'm interested in your perspective as someone who was right in the bowels of the mainstream media. If you think these people are actively engaging in like understanding what they're doing, this propagandizing, or is it so ingrained in their ideology that they just think that's the way the world is?
There might be some of them who are aware of what they're doing, and there's some of them that are more activists than others. Like some of them I see and I'm like, you're outright doing activism. And then there's others who just simply don't understand what truth is. And they don't understand that there is truth that is infallible and that is not subjective. And I think that's a lot of people nowadays, is they don't understand that there's a basis for truth, and we've really lost that as a culture. For example, when I was covering COVID in a way that was critical of government lockdowns and against government overreach, my editor's criticism was that not enough people in government were speaking out against what the government was doing, because we didn't have much of an official opposition at that time, really any opposition at all to what the government was doing. But the answer isn't what is the opposition saying. The answer is what is the truth to what the government is doing. And the opposition isn't necessarily going to be the champion for that truth. And they certainly weren't during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the question isn't always what is the government saying, what is the opposition saying. It's measuring what the government is doing versus some standard of truth. As a society, we have really lost what truth is and what that standard of truth is.
All right, let's get a little philosophical here then. What is truth?
Oh, goodness. Okay, well, I came on to discuss politics, not philosophy. But
right.
I'm a Christian, and there's also no, okay, let's start from the beginning. I'm a Christian. The truth is God's word, and the truth is that God has inherently given us our rights. We derive our rights from God. The government derives its authority from God. The government does not have power over our bodies to decide what we get to put into them. And the government is seeking to act as God these days, which, yeah, I don't know. What do you think truth is?
No, I would agree with that assessment. I think it's an alignment with reality, right? And I think the problem, like a lie is claiming something that is not true. So what is truth, right? It's like you said, it's an alignment with reality. And what is reality? Well, as Christians, we would say reality is that God is God and he created all things. And then also further down that line, that Jesus was born and lived as a man and died on the cross for our sins, right? That would be truth within the religious context. But I often don't like, because we are Christians, but there are people who listen who aren't. I often like to say, look, there's a way that things are and there's a way that things aren't, right? For example, there are two genders. Whether we like it or not, there are men and women.
I'm offended now.
There are men and women. There is gravity. So like a really good example of truth is if you jump off a building, you will fall, right? And whether we like falling or not is irrelevant to the fact that you will fall. But a lot of the way our culture has gone, at least in my opinion, is we've descended into this idea that this Gnostic idea, which is an ancient, cult or heresy or whatever you want to call it, that we are just these spirits floating around in the world that can mold reality into whatever we want it to be. When in fact, reality is there. Like you said, it's just true. It's objective. And when you stray from reality, you live in lies. And lies are destructive to your psyche and all of these things. I think that's why culture is the way it is. But I think the reason I ask you that question is because I think how we determine what is true plays a very big role. And as Western civilization, we've kind of have this agreement, which is the way we figure out what's true is by constantly questioning everything, which is kind of what a journalist does, right? Or should do is constantly question things. Doubt is our path to truth through science, right? Our path to best aligning ourselves with reality is constantly questioning things. But the interesting thing about this COVID pandemic, this situation you were in at iPolitics, the situation with the mainstream media, like what you said about your colleagues not really knowing what truth is that we've now been teaching everyone that you make the truth. You decide what's true. And I think that's ludicrous. But yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I agree. And I think also not only you decide what truth is, but what the majority wants is what truth is. We've confused those things. So if the majority of people are in favor of vaccine mandates, that means that's good and that's right, which, I mean, you don't have to look far in history to see many societies the majority has wanted something, have gone down very wrong paths, which I'm sure those countries have later regretted as a whole. But yeah, we've lost sort of an objective standard. And I appreciate, your willingness to find a middle ground for your viewers that aren't Christians. But I would say the truth that I derive from my Christian faith is what I believe is the only truth. And if people don't agree with that, I don't make any apologies for that.
Yes, no, I understand what you're saying. I think just trying to explain that perspective to people who don't hold the same beliefs, but it's like that truth exists and that it is true, right? And that it's objective and that it's real, and it doesn't matter what anyone says about it. It doesn't matter what the majority says. It doesn't matter if every human on earth said it wasn't true. If it is true, it's true. And
right.
This is, I think, yeah.
I was just going to add, I think it's also easier to do hard things when you have some objective belief about what truth is, because then when you are being criticized, or you lose your job, or you lose friends, or you lose family over these things, you'll have a reason for doing it. It's much harder to stand for the principles that you believe in if you don't believe that they're objectively right.
Yeah. Yes. Very true.
Zach, I had a question.
What do you think makes truth, Zach? I want to hear your thoughts.
What do I think makes truth?
Or what is truth?
Well, it's certainly not what you decide it is. That's for certain. You don't get to decide. I think, Rachel, you said alignment with reality, and I think that's what Kaylin Ford said as well, if I remember correctly, because we talked a lot about on that episode, and that's for the listeners, if you haven't listened to it, one of my favorite episodes that we've done, an absolutely incredible conversation. Reality is not malleable. We can dance around it, but reality is harder than stone. And so, yeah, I would agree that alignment with reality is definitely what truth is. But if possible, I would love to rewind, because I wanted to ask a question regarding something you said earlier. And it's kind of funny. This question might be best for Rachel. It might also be best for David, because David has worked on the other side of this perspective. You said when you were in Ottawa, the Ottawa bubble, right? All of the questions were, why aren't there more mandates? Why aren't there more lockdowns? Why aren't we forcing a third dose? Why? All that direction. So I guess I'll pose this question to both of you. Do you think, to some degree, the questions that journalists bring to the table in Ottawa influence the way some of these politicians believe the people feel about the problems the country is facing?
David, you go first.
I think it's probably even more nefarious than that in my experience, in that there are people who spend a lot of time talking to journalists and influencing their perspective on what questions need to be asked. And I think that journalists are incredibly busy right now. They've got, I think Rachel mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but there's not enough journalists to cover everything, and they're all overworked and underpaid, and none of these media companies are making any money, which is why the government's bailing everybody out. And it's really quite I wouldn't say toxic work environment, but definitely a very overworked work environment. And so a lot of times, the journalists are just being fed information by tons of different sources. And there are people, and I've been one of these people, who then will just feed information to journalists they know that can be then pushed out to the wider public, and then could even be asked as questions to politicians. So yes, you're right, Zach, to a degree. I think that journalists are trying to ask the questions they think that people care about, but how they figure out what people care about can often be influenced by politicians as well. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Rachel.
No, I think that's a good perspective to have. It is definitely a different perspective than I would have, because I'm often unsure how things I write impact people within government. Sometimes you'll sort of get a little bit of a trickle down. So-and-so really didn't appreciate this article. So-and-so, thought this was funny. You'll hear it here and there, but especially now, it's often quite infrequent that you'll write something and you'll see an immediate impact. It does still happen, very rewarding when that happens, but it is quite infrequent. I do think sometimes the questions that journalists ask when they're being quite critical of the government, they do have changed. So, for example, you might remember the US government recently announced they were going to have this disinformation board, and they just got yes, the Ministry of Truth. They got absolutely hammered on that. Like, people were so pissed, rightfully so. It was just such a disaster. And then they sort of put a pause button on it. And then I believe it's been axed now entirely. So that is an example. And, there was lots of different people going after them for that, not just journalists. But I think that was an example of when you saw a time when media collectively was being very critical of the government for something and they pulled back the reins on it. And so maybe this is the opposite of what you're asking, but I sometimes wonder if media as a whole had decided to be much more critical of the government from the get-go, if the government would have been quicker to pull back some of these restrictions, whereas the media sort of acted as their cheerleaders for them instead.
Well, yeah, I agree. Journalism is certainly not a official arm of the government, but if you talk about checks and balances, our system is set up so that there are supposed to be checks and balances. And I think the first informal outside of the actual system that would act as a check and balance to the government would be journalists, would be the media, would be the people asking critical questions. But there was a vast absence of that over the past 2 years. And I think you're right. I think if we had more, I guess, independent thinkers in journalism, we could have maybe changed the trajectory of our country in a positive way. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a fair criticism. I'm not sure exactly what it would take to get there, but I think if more journalists had been quick to see the impact, I guess the bigger question too is like when we looked at COVID and we looked at public health, it was like, why are we only looking at this one metric? And we were only ever looking at sort of case counts, maybe hospitalizations, maybe deaths, but even barely that because there were not very many. We weren't looking at what public health meant across the board. We weren't looking at opioid crisis, which was on the rise. There was an article written about it here or there, but that was never seen as the all of government approach. It was really just focusing on keeping the case counts down. Yeah, the opioid crisis, mental health, cancer screenings being missed, all these things were sort of slipping through the cracks, domestic abuse in the home, all these things were on the rise, and none of those things seemed to matter during COVID. We just let all go to the wayside. So there was lots of angles that journalists missed during the pandemic, and yeah, it was definitely a failure on the part of the government, but also I think Canadian media.
Yeah. Do you think?
Why? Oh,
go ahead, David.
Go ahead, Zach. No, go.
Do you think the hyper focus on one metric was fear-based? I mean, so the case count for sure is the easiest thing to sensationalize because it's the largest number and it's the number that changes the most drastically and the most quickly. And it's the easiest metric to go, oh no, look at that. Do you think that's fear-based or do you think it's something else? Do you think it was just benign oversight?
Fear-based, maybe more. This is getting really good metrics for our website, and no one has cared about watching CTV News or CBC News for years now, and all of a sudden our ratings are going up conveniently during this pandemic. There's also something, another criticism of journalists is there is a lot of pressure to have a lot of clicks on your articles. And so that is going to cause people to do things they might not otherwise do.
Yeah.
So the incentives are wrong. Now, interestingly enough, and this brings us to a topic I definitely wanted to discuss, which is mainstream media versus the new media, and not just what it's like to work in them, but kind of you've seen the inside of both, and you have seen the societal impact of both. Now, you were there in Ottawa for some filming for when the protest was broken up. What did you see in contrast to being on the ground and watching what was happening versus how it was being portrayed by your colleagues in the mainstream media?
Sure. So Truckers' Freedom Convoy. So I covered it especially closely when they were being pushed out of Ottawa, as I mentioned, sort of avoided writing about it for iPolitics just because I knew I was going to be quite uncomfortable with the manner in which I would have to portray the Freedom Convoy. But I did cover it quite closely when the police actually came and forcibly removed protesters off of Ottawa. And up until that point, I lived downtown in Ottawa, so I was walking around during the protest, getting a sense for things. Seemed pretty okay. Like it was actually an interesting. I just thought it was so interesting, and I thought I was so lucky to be there in Ottawa during one of the coolest parts of Canada's history. Like especially since I've been alive and old enough to remember Canadian history. I just thought it was really cool. There was trucks everywhere. It definitely wasn't easy to drive around, but there was an emergency lane that they left open. People were very polite to me. No one was ever rude to me. None of the truckers were. They were just out there doing their thing, hanging out. They had bouncy castles. They had this inflatable hot tub. Kids would come up. They would play hockey in the middle of the streets. The truckers were also, they did a lot for the homeless. Ottawa has a really, really bad homeless problem. So they were feeding the homeless. They were just shoveling the streets. I remember one time I was walking and they were shoveling the streets and I was like, oh, what are you guys doing? Like, I was just curious. I thought maybe they were like trying to set up barriers for when the police came, and they were like, oh, well, it's got to get clean. So we just thought we'd shovel the streets. I just thought that was so funny. The only thing that I thought was maybe like a little obnoxious is, sometimes they would kind of just yell at people that were wearing masks outside. I remember one day this girl had a loudspeaker on her back and she was just like walking around like telling people to take their masks off. Like it was really quite harmless. Like it was maybe a bit obnoxious. And in Canada, if you're obnoxious, I guess that's considered harassment, especially in a place like Ottawa. But there was nothing dangerous about them. They were quite nice. It was just genuinely a fine group of people, a fine group of Canadians, but totally different than the culture that you'd find in Ottawa. These are blue-collared workers. These are not like Ottawa and the civil servants that you'll find there. So just diametrically opposed, culturally very different. So then when they got pushed out of Ottawa, the police came and they just kind of kept moving their line forward, and protesters would try to hold their line, but would inevitably get kind of pushed out of the way. And that happened for 2 days until they were completely pushed out of the Capitol. What I just described versus what you would have seen in the media. The truckers were really portrayed as dangerous, as a dangerous bunch. There was a lot of rumors that they must have weapons in their vehicles because they did find some at the Coots border. None were ever found in any of the truckers' vehicles in Ottawa. That ended up being a big thing that's kind of been unveiled later on. I think, the thing that's interesting about the truckers' convoy is how it's going to be remembered in Canadian history. And we've seen Canadian media having to walk back so many of the stories that were published about the convoy. I think, if you think, the question really is, these are people that felt that they had no other choice but to spend their money, drive up to Ottawa, park their vehicles there, and live out of their trucks in the dead of a Canadian winter so that the government would hear their voice. And the Canadian government was unwilling to send a single representative to meet with any of these people to discuss their concerns, and instead used the harshest force of legislation that they had to remove them from the Capitol, as opposed to making a single effort to speak with a single protester that came to Ottawa, and to forcibly remove people out of the city. Now, some people might think they had no right to come to Ottawa and to park their vehicles in the Capitol. This is people's homes. People live here. They were quite loud. I guess that was the one thing I failed to mention. The horns were quite obnoxious as well, especially at the beginning. They did settle down with the horns. I think they realized it was maybe a bit much. The horns were super obnoxious at first. So, that's up for you to decide if you think that they had a right to come there and to park their trucks. If you think Ottawa was people's homes and they had absolutely no right to be there, I'm not going to make the call on whether they were right to do that or not. That's, I think, up for each individual person to decide, knowing the facts about what happened in Ottawa.
Zach?
Yeah. Here's a question. How it's remembered in history. You said something very interesting about that. You said already we're seeing so much of like the kind of narrative that was floated out by the mainstream they're having to claw that back, right? Who puts that pressure on companies like, let's say, the CBC or CTV to like how do you push toward a retraction? What does that mechanism look like?
What I've mostly seen in terms of mechanisms has been public sort of outrage on Twitter. But the thing that's worth noting is a lot of times these retractions are slipped into stories or slipped onto the CBC's page quite quietly.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have journalists that are really paying attention to these things, like Andrew Lawton at True North or Blacklock's reporters will often pick up on these things. So then the fact that CBC had to retract a story becomes its own. Yeah, it becomes its own news story. So that's sort of what we've seen, these retractions and corrections being slipped in quite quietly. We see that across the board in MSM. When they change something, they do it very quietly, sneakily, but we have a lot of people that are really watching these things. So it usually gets out. The unfortunate thing is, I don't know if it's really doing much to change people's minds or if it's just kind of digging people in further, people that would support CBC and support their coverage. I don't know if they're seeing these retractions or corrections being issued. I kind of doubt it. I think people that were already opposed and took issue with CBC's coverage during the convoy are the ones that are more likely to see their corrections being made later on. I could be totally wrong about this, but I doubt many people's minds are being changed either way. I doubt sort of media as a whole really works to change people's minds. These days, it seems like it just kind of further entrenches people's biases, but I could be mistaken.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right. And I think, John Doe, who's in his 70s and watches the CBC religiously, is probably not watching True North for a story about a CBC retraction. He's probably not there,
Probably not.
No,
Probably not.
So I think you're right. David, did we miss anything?
I got, I'm not sure if she wants to share yet, but Rachel's working on a cool project with her brother. I don't know if you want to tell the audience about that or if you want to wait.
Sure. My brother and I are making a documentary about the truckers convoy, actually. I'm not sure when it will be ready, hopefully maybe by the fall or late summer. So we're kind of just going over all aspects of it, the coverage that had to be retracted. The Emergencies Act, of course, is very interesting. Some of the Bitcoin stuff that was being used to actually help truckers. Bitcoin was basically being handed out to truckers in Ottawa so that they could buy things and afford things. So we're going to be taking a look at basically everything that happened, just a wide snapshot of the whole convoy. And I'll have lots of updates for that as it becomes closer to being completed, I'm sure.
Well, once it's done, we'll have to have you back on to talk about it. And I mean, we had Dr. McCullough and his friend John, was it Leake? Sorry.
John Leake, yeah.
John Leake on, it was published today, actually.
Yep.
And they were promoting their book. So we'll definitely have you on to promote your documentary.
That's great. And my brother, because I'm going to be honest, he's definitely doing way more of the work on this than I am.
Yes, love you both on.
Yeah. I did want to add actually one thing. May I add one thing?
Yes.
Earlier, you had asked about mainstream media versus new independent media. What I would say is that I feel like I have a leg up on independent people who start in independent media who didn't go to journalism school, just because there's so much experience and there's just like a wealth of knowledge within mainstream media that's been there for decades, that's just passed down from generation to generation. Because independent media is younger and there's just less of us, we don't have that same wealth of knowledge. We just don't have the same resources. I do think it would be a bad thing for Canada if mainstream media journalists just dried up overnight. I think what we need to raise up good journalists in independent media and maybe even have some MSM colleagues help train new journalists, because like there's so many skills that my colleagues in the mainstream media have I just don't possess. There's just some things I'm just not good at. I'm not really good going through documents. I like to talk to people and get information that way. I like to have close with sources, but then you have some journalists that are really introverted and spend a lot of time researching stuff. So I think it would be a shame just to lose all those journalists. And I do have a lot of respect for the knowledge and the skills that they've accrued over years. And it is important knowledge that does serve the Canadian public at times. So I would just say that my perspective wouldn't be one that we just need to abolish MSM, is we need to find a way to use their knowledge in maybe a more effective way.
And maybe it's about incentives. Maybe we need to change the incentive structure, like not have the government be the one paying their salaries, and also probably not having clicks be the metric by which we determine whether something's true.
Yeah.
Yes. Well,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
You're the guest, I insist.
Oh, well.
People hear me talk enough. They don't want to hear anything more from me.
Yeah. They hear him every week.
I was just going to say, David, to your latter point about like maybe clicks shouldn't be the basis for what truth is. That's been a criticism of journalism for a very long time. Obviously, the government funding, people's salaries, that's a huge problem that we definitely need to move away from. But it's just funny that journalists and like journalism as an industry that's so critical of everything the government does and is basically so critical of everything every industry doesn't realize they have this like massive plank in their eye, like, oh, the government, which we're covering, is paying for all our salaries. Like, it's hilariously ironic, but it's like you have to laugh or you'll cry. But also just this industry that's so critical of everyone hasn't been able to come up with a structure where they can actually earn money for themselves. Like, it's just kind of laughable. And it can be done because the Western Standard is doing it. So it's really just the lack of innovation that we're seeing there, which often happens when the government decides to step in. So
almost always.
I would like to add one more point to that too. I think the responsibility also falls onto the shoulder of just everyday Canadians, because, I mean, journalists are like anyone else trying to make money, and money is driven by clicks. And if Canadians were more responsible with how they consumed media, and they themselves were more conscious of their own biases and how they maybe view things, if we could create a culture that propelled honest journalism over sensational journalism, there would be more incentive for those stories to be written. So I think there's responsibility to share all around,
Agreed.
Absolutely. And on the topic of being, a responsible consumer, I think Canadians should start paying for journalism and stop expecting to get it for free. So if you're not already subscribing to the Western Standard, absolutely go do that today.
Absolutely. Good pitch.
She does her job well. She does it well.
Exactly. Derek would be proud. Derek's been on twice and he hasn't even talked about it as much as you have. So it's awesome.
Great. Well, I'll make a good pitch for a bonus then.
Well, Rachel,
all right. Well, thank you very much for coming, Rachel. We really appreciate it. And thank you for standing up for the truth in the face of a lot of opposition.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And really quickly, where can people find you online?
Best to find me on Twitter at Emmanuel_Rach.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's the CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great our country is.